The night was particularly cruel, the kind that seemed to stretch into eternity, where even the gas lamps lining Baker Street flickered in defiance against the howling wind. Inside 221B, Sherlock Holmes sat by the hearth, his long, delicate fingers resting on the bridge of his nose, eyes closed as if lost in the labyrinth of his thoughts. A violin lay across his lap, its bow resting idly on the side table. He had played earlier, but even the melancholic notes of his instrument had failed to ease the restlessness brewing in his mind. The case from the previous week had been resolved too quickly for his liking, leaving a void that no experiment nor deduction could fill. The night stretched on, and Holmes remained seated, his silhouette casting a sharp figure against the dim glow of the fire. Watson had long since retired, his soft breathing audible from the adjacent room. Holmes knew he should rest, but rest was a luxury he afforded only when his mind was exhausted beyond all function. At present his faculties were razor-sharp, seeking a problem worthy of their engagement. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps against the wooden door, precise and controlled yet urgent. Holmes did not move at first, merely opening his eyes, his mind already deciphering the visitor's temperament. The hesitation between the knocks, the weight behind each strike. It was not the erratic panic of a common man, nor the indifferent rap of a messenger. This was someone in distress, but one who carried himself with the poise of a man of importance. Holmes rose, his dressing gown flowing around him as he moved with deliberate grace. He reached for the door and pulled it open. A man stood there, drenched from head to toe, water pooling beneath his polished boots. His coat clung to his form, and his breathing was uneven, his expression that of a man who had glimpsed something unnatural and lived to speak of it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the unmistakable bearing of nobility. Yet his composure was broken, as though something had chipped away at the solid foundation of his confidence. Lord Benjamin Harrington III, a well-known figure in both political and artistic circles, stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His movements were stiff, as though every muscle in his body resisted the action. Holmes closed the door behind him, watching as the man hesitated before finally speaking. But the words did not come immediately. Instead, Harrington reached into the soaked folds of his coat and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He handed it over without a word. Holmes took it, his fingers running over the damp surface before unfolding it carefully. The ink had bled, slightly, but the message remained legible. It was brief, devoid of pleasantries or embellishment. A singular line, written in a hand that was both precise and cold. "You will not make it to the end of the week. The price must be paid." Holmes read it twice, his mind absorbing not just the words but the way they had been written, the pressure of the ink, the slant of the penmanship. He turned the paper over, noting the absence of a signature, a seal, or any identifying mark. Then, without looking up, he addressed his guest. Lord Harrington did not answer immediately. Instead, he sank into the nearest chair, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. He looked at his hands as though they did not belong to him, his breathing steady, but shallow. It was only after a moment that he finally spoke. It had begun 2 nights prior. His younger brother Elliot had vanished without a trace from their family estate. The disappearance had been sudden, inexplicable. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no indication of where he had gone. One moment he had been in his chambers, and the next, he was simply gone. The household had searched extensively, but the more they looked, the more it seemed as though Elliot had never existed at all. Then the note had arrived. Slipped under the door of Lord Harrington's private study, its message simple but chilling. The moment he had read it, a weight had settled on his chest, a certainty that something far more sinister was at play than a mere disappearance. His first instinct had been to go to the authorities, but a deep sense of unease had stopped him. Scotland Yard was predictable, inefficient. There were threats one could not bring to the attention of the law. This was one of them. Holmes listened without interruption, his fingers steepled as he leaned slightly forward. The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows across the room. When Lord Harrington finished speaking, silence settled between them, thick with unspoken conclusions. Holmes reached for his pipe, lighting it with a practiced flick of his match. He inhaled deeply, letting the tendrils of smoke curl around him before finally responding. His words were measured, his voice calm, but there was something in his tone that suggested an unspoken gravity. Elliot's disappearance and the note, two seemingly distinct events, could not be mere coincidence. There was a connection, buried beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. And yet, Holmes found himself unsettled. There was something different about this case, an undercurrent of finality in the words scrawled upon that note. He had seen threats before, had encountered countless cases of blackmail, revenge, and deceit. But this had the air of something far older, something steeped in a history Lord Harrington had not yet disclosed. His eyes never left the nobleman, studying him with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. Then, after a pause, he spoke again. There was no doubt in his mind Lord Harrington was withholding something. Whether out of fear, pride, or ignorance, Holmes could not yet determine. But he would. For now there was only one course of action. They would begin where all mysteries did, with the last place Elliot had been seen. Holmes stood, signaling that the conversation was over. Lord Harrington, understanding the unspoken command, rose as well, his movements slow, deliberate. The night was not over. In fact, Holmes knew with certainty it had only just begun. The next morning, Holmes and Watson arrived at the Harrington estate, a grand but eerily silent manor on the outskirts of London. The carriage came to a halt before the wrought iron gates, their ornate designs casting long, curling shadows on the gravel drive. Holmes stepped down first, his eyes sweeping over the estate with a calculated intensity. The air carried a peculiar stillness, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Watson followed, adjusting his coat against the damp chill of the morning. He observed the house, noting the well-manicured hedges and the pristine marble steps leading to the entrance. Despite its grandeur, an unnatural silence hung over the property, and he could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. Holmes, ever perceptive, did not acknowledge Watson's discomfort, but instead advanced toward the heavy oak doors, rapping 3 times with the iron knocker. A butler, elderly yet impeccably dressed, answered the door. He stepped aside without a word, ushering them into the grand foyer. The scent of old books and polished wood filled the air, mingling with something subtler, something Watson could not quite place. The butler led them through the cavernous halls, his footsteps soft against the thick rugs, before finally stopping before a set of tall mahogany doors. He knocked once before pushing them open. Inside, Lord Harrington sat behind an enormous desk, the morning light casting deep lines across his face. He appeared even more exhausted than the night before, his posture stiff as he looked up at his visitors. Holmes stepped forward first, glancing at the papers strewn across the desk. Watson followed, keeping a watchful eye on their host. Lord Harrington gestured toward a chair, though Holmes remained standing. Without preamble, he produced the crumpled note from his pocket and placed it on the desk. Lord Harrington exhaled, rubbing his temples before leaning forward. He admitted that there had been no new developments overnight. The estate had been thoroughly searched, every room checked, yet Elliot remained missing. No ransom note had arrived, and there were no demands, only silence. The more he spoke, the more his voice wavered, as though he himself was unsure of the reality of his situation. Holmes listened, his gaze unwavering. He noted the subtle tremor in Lord Harrington's fingers, the way his eyes darted toward the large windows as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the mist outside. Then, without a word, Holmes turned and strode toward the double doors. Watson followed hastily, leaving their host staring after them in confusion. Holmes moved with purpose through the halls, his gaze flickering across the elaborate portraits and heavy drapery. He reached the staircase and ascended without hesitation, his sharp mind already piecing together fragments of the puzzle. He arrived at Elliot's chambers, pushing open the door without waiting for an invitation. The room was untouched, too perfectly preserved. The bed was neatly made, books stacked on the writing desk, and an open journal rested beside them. Watson entered behind him, his eyes scanning the space for any sign of a struggle. Holmes moved to the desk first, his fingers ghosting over the journal's pages. Elliot's handwriting was neat, methodical, but something about the final entry stood out. The ink was darker, pressed into the paper with more force. It was a single word written and underlined twice: Blackwood. Watson stepped closer, peering over Holmes's shoulder. He recognized the name, a small village known for its superstitions and its reluctance toward outsiders. Holmes tapped the word lightly, his mind already racing ahead. Then he turned, scanning the rest of the room. His eyes landed on a bookshelf, and he moved toward it without hesitation. His fingers trailed along the spines until he pulled a single volume free. The title was unremarkable, but as he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. Pressed between the leaves of the book was a note, written in the same careful hand as the journal. The message was brief. "If anything happens, find me at Blackwood." I had no choice. Holmes straightened, slipping the note into his coat. He knew, then, that Elliot's disappearance was not a simple abduction. Elliot had left of his own accord, though whether by necessity or coercion, Holmes could not yet say. He turned back to Watson, who had been studying the fireplace. A faint layer of soot marred the edge of the hearth, and the faintest scent of burnt paper lingered in the air. Someone had attempted to destroy evidence. Then came the scream. Both men turned sharply, the cry echoing through the halls. Without hesitation, Holmes rushed from the room, Watson on his heels. The sound had come from the lower level, and as they descended the grand staircase, they found the butler standing rigid in the foyer, his face ashen. He pointed toward the study, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. Holmes pushed past him, entering the room. Lord Harrington stood before his desk, his hand trembling as he clutched another letter. The paper was nailed to the wooden surface, with an ornate dagger, its hilt gleaming in the morning light. Holmes crossed the room in swift strides, prying the note free. The message was chilling in its simplicity. "Do not seek him, or you will join him in the dark." Holmes's grip on the paper tightened. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was far more sinister than he had anticipated. Blackwood was not just a place, it was the key to everything. He turned to Watson, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he strode from the room, his course already set. They would go to Blackwood, and they would find Elliot. The town of Blackwood lay shrouded in mist, its narrow streets winding like veins through the heart of a place long forgotten by time. Holmes and Watson arrived by carriage, the wheels groaning against the uneven cobblestones as they slowed to a stop near the town's single inn. Holmes stepped out first, his sharp gaze cutting through the gloom, taking in the quiet stillness that hung over the settlement like a curse. Watson followed, his unease growing with every step as he noted the wary glances of the few townsfolk who lingered in the doorways, their faces partially obscured by the thick fog. The innkeeper, a stout man with hollowed eyes, barely spoke as he handed over the key to their room. Holmes took it without acknowledgement, already deducing the fear that gripped the man's heart. There was something in Blackwood that silenced its people, something lurking just beneath the surface. Holmes led the way upstairs, pushing open the door to their modest lodgings before turning to Watson. Without waiting for pleasantries, he retrieved Elliot's note from his coat and placed it on the small wooden desk. The name Blackwood had been written in the young man's own hand, and yet the weight of its meaning remained elusive. Holmes wasted no time. He instructed Watson to rest briefly while he ventured into the town alone. The doctor protested, but Holmes had already anticipated his concerns. There was no room for debate. He exited swiftly, his coat billowing in the wind as he stepped back onto the empty streets. His first destination was the local records office, a dimly lit establishment at the edge of town. Inside, he found an elderly clerk hunched over a stack of ledgers, his thin fingers trembling as he traced the inked names of those long since buried. Holmes approached with quiet purpose, scanning the volumes until his eyes landed on the section detailing disappearances. Elliot's name was not there, but others were, names stretching back years, decades. The pattern was unmistakable. Young men vanishing without explanation, their disappearances never investigated beyond whispered rumors and unspoken fears. Holmes traced a gloved finger down the list, his mind racing as he connected the threads. Blackwood was not merely a hiding place, it was a hunting ground. Something had drawn Elliot here, something that had lured others before him. As he exited the records office, the town's atmosphere seemed to shift. The fog thickened, wrapping around the buildings like a living thing. Holmes quickened his pace, heading toward the last known location Elliot had mentioned. The house, at the edge of town, stood alone, its windows dark, its structure half consumed by creeping ivy. Holmes approached cautiously, his footsteps near soundless against the damp earth. He reached for the doorknob, finding it unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of decay and something fouler lurking beneath. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the cracked shutters. Holmes moved forward, scanning the space with meticulous precision. A single chair sat at the center of the room, its ropes still tied around the arms, as though waiting for its next occupant. The markings on the walls, scrawled in what looked like ink, told a tale he could not yet decipher. Then from the corner of his eye he noticed the disturbance, a loose floorboard, its edges worn from recent movement. He knelt, prying it open with deft hands. Beneath it lay a small bundle of papers, wrapped tightly in twine. He unraveled them, scanning the words hastily scribbled across the parchment. Elliot's handwriting stood out among the others, his words desperate, frantic. He spoke of shadows that moved without light, of whispers that beckoned him to follow, of a presence that watched from the darkness. Holmes's grip on the papers tightened. Elliot had been here. He had left these messages behind, knowing someone might find them. Then, from above, the floorboards groaned. Holmes froze, his senses sharpening as he listened. Someone, or something, was moving on the second floor. He rose slowly, tucking the papers into his coat as he stepped toward the narrow staircase. Each step creaked beneath his weight, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. He reached the landing, his eyes sweeping across the dimly lit corridor. A door at the end stood slightly ajar. Holmes moved toward it, pushing it open just enough to peer inside. The room was empty save for a single object resting atop the wooden dresser, a pocket watch, its chain coiled neatly beside it. Holmes recognized it instantly. It belonged to Elliot. He reached for it, but the moment his fingers brushed against the cool metal, a whispering sound filled the air. He turned sharply, but the hallway behind him remained empty. Holmes did not scare easily, but there was something unnatural about the quiet that followed. He pocketed the watch and moved swiftly back downstairs. The weight of the house pressed down on him, as though it resented his presence. He exited into the fog, his mind already formulating his next course of action. Elliot had been taken, but not in the conventional sense. He had followed something willingly, something that had called to him from the depths of Blackwood's shadows. Back at the inn, Watson paced near the window, his concern deepening with every passing minute. When Holmes finally returned, his expression was unreadable. He produced the pocket watch, placing it on the table between them. Watson stared, recognizing it instantly. The implications of its presence were clear. Elliot had been in that house, and he had left behind more than just his possessions. Holmes began explaining, his voice measured as he laid out his findings. The disappearances were not random, nor were they isolated. They formed a pattern, a cycle that stretched back generations. The people of Blackwood knew, but they did not speak of it. Fear had silenced them. Elliot had discovered something he was not meant to know, and now he had vanished into the depths of that knowledge. Holmes turned to Watson, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. They would not leave Blackwood until they had answers. They would find Elliot, even if it meant stepping into the very shadows that had swallowed him whole. The case had taken a turn, and for the first time, Holmes felt the weight of something far greater than logic pressing against the edges of his reason. The house at Blackwood had not simply been abandoned, it had been waiting. The morning light barely penetrated, the thick mist that clung to the streets of Blackwood. Holmes had been awake for hours, sitting in the chair by the small wooden table in their rented room at the inn, his fingers steepled in thought. The pocket watch that once belonged to Elliot lay before him, its polished surface reflecting the dim glow of the single candle that burned beside it. Watson stirred from his sleep, shifting in his bed before finally sitting up, rubbing his eyes as he observed the unmoving figure of his companion. Holmes had spent the night poring over every detail they had gathered so far. The house where Elliot had last been seen, the cryptic messages, the lingering fear in the townspeople's eyes. Everything pointed toward something deliberately hidden, something only spoken of in hushed whispers. He knew that waiting would bring them no closer to the truth. They had to act, and they had to act now. He stood abruptly, causing Watson to fully awaken. Without wasting another moment, Holmes retrieved his coat and gestured toward the door. Watson, though still weary, knew better than to question him when his mind was set. He dressed quickly and followed as Holmes led them out into the fog-covered streets. The town was silent, more so than usual. Not even the faint sound of morning activity could be heard. It was as if Blackwood itself had fallen into an eerie stillness, anticipating what was to come. Holmes and Watson made their way toward the house, its darkened windows like empty eyes staring at them through the mist. The heavy wooden door stood ajar, just as Holmes had left it the night before. Inside, the air was colder than it had been. The oppressive silence wrapped around them like a vice, every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet echoing through the empty corridors. Holmes moved with purpose, retracing his steps to the second floor, where he had found Elliot's watch. The door to the small chamber at the end of the hall remained open, as if inviting them inside. Holmes entered first, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. The watch had been placed on the dresser, a deliberate act rather than an accident. He knew Elliot had left it there as a clue, a silent plea to be found. Watson followed closely, his unease evident in the way his fingers twitched at his sides. Holmes ignored it, focusing instead on the walls, the floor, the very air around them. Something had been here, something that had taken Elliot away. Then a sound broke the silence. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but Holmes caught it instantly, a whisper, barely audible, as if carried by the walls themselves. He turned sharply, his keen ears straining to pinpoint its source. Watson tensed beside him, his own instincts warning him that they were no longer alone. Holmes stepped forward, his hand brushing against the wooden paneling of the wall. There was something beneath the surface, something hidden just beyond their reach. He pressed his palm against one of the panels, feeling the subtle give beneath his fingers. Without hesitation, he pushed harder, and the section of the wall shifted, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. The darkness within was absolute. Holmes did not hesitate, stepping inside with measured caution. Watson followed, his breath shallow as they descended into the unseen depths of the house. The passage twisted and turned, its damp stone walls pressing in around them. Then the passage opened into a chamber, its low ceiling casting deep shadows across the cold floor. At the center of the room stood a chair, its arms still bound with rope. Elliot had been here. Holmes could feel it in the air, in the very weight of the space around them. He moved forward, his fingers brushing over the rough wood. The ropes had been cut, but the fibers still held the impression of restrained wrists. Watson hovered near the entrance, his eyes darting around the chamber as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Then, another sound. This time, it was closer, unmistakably human. A ragged breath, a weak cough. Holmes turned sharply, his gaze snapping to the far corner of the chamber. There, slumped against the stone wall, was a figure barely clinging to consciousness. Elliot. Holmes reached him first, kneeling beside the young man as he assessed his condition. Elliot's skin was pale, his eyes half-lidded, his breath shallow, but present. Watson joined him, checking for injuries as Holmes examined their surroundings. The bindings had been cut, but the bruises around Elliot's wrists suggested he had been held here for some time. Elliot stirred, his voice barely above a whisper. He muttered something, incoherent at first, then repeated it more clearly. Holmes leaned in, catching the words as they left his lips. They told me not to speak, not to tell. Holmes's eyes darkened. Someone had kept Elliot here, had tried to break him, to silence him. But who, and why? There was no time to dwell on questions. Holmes helped Elliot to his feet, supporting his weight as they moved toward the passageway. Watson followed, his senses heightened as they navigated back toward the surface. As they emerged into the main house, the air felt different, lighter, yet filled with something unspoken. The town had known. The people of Blackwood had chosen silence, had chosen fear over justice. Elliot had uncovered something he was never meant to see, and he had paid the price. Holmes knew that whatever force had orchestrated this would not simply vanish. There were still shadows lurking beneath Blackwood's surface, still secrets waiting to be unearthed. Back at the inn, they laid Elliot down, tending to his wounds as best as they could. He was weak but alive. Holmes sat by the window, watching the mist swirl through the streets. The answers had not all been found, but one truth remained clear. Blackwood was not just a town. It was a warning. Holmes had solved countless cases in his lifetime, had unraveled the most complex of mysteries. But this time, there was no triumph, no satisfaction in the resolution. This time, the case had left something behind, an absence, a question that could never truly be answered. As the first light of dawn pierced through the mist, Holmes knew one thing for certain. Some mysteries were never meant to be solved.